Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, August 5th. Yeah, that's today. And it is time for the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network and hosted in this particular iteration by Keith. That's me. This week we are finishing up our discussion on A Scanner Darkly, which is a novel by Philip K. Dick. I watched the movie a few weeks ago, really loved it, decided that I was going to give the book a shot, and just finished the book this week. Definitely made a point to finish it this week. Felt like the discussion was kind of getting a little repetitive, and you'll be happy to know that it will kind of continue to do so today. The book and the movie are actually really closely aligned, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. I don't think the movie took hardly any liberties with the material from the novel. So pretty much anything that happens in the novel was free game, and they weren't able to cover everything that happens in the novel and the movie because the movie's only an hour and a half long. So I was relatively surprised. I don't know if I'd say pleasantly surprised, though. I was hoping that there'd be at least a little bit of difference. I guess if I wasn't trying to talk about this for like the podcast, the fact that everything is pretty much the same would be a good thing. Because the book is really, really great. And honestly, if I had listened to / read the book before I watched the movie, I think I would have liked it even more. So if you haven't done either, listen to / read the book first. I don't think it's that long. My ability to judge the length of books has been kind of permanently damaged because of the Hyperion novels, as well as a longer book of philosophy that I'm reading right now called A Guide for the Perplexed. So, yeah. Today we're just going to spend a bunch of time going over how the book ended, and then we'll probably compare and contrast the movie. We'll talk about a little bit of Philip K. Dick's theories and statements on drug use and things like that. So, yeah, let's just get right to it. So, I think last time when we had left off, we were kind of we were getting into like the paranoia, split brain damage type scenario where Bob Arctor had started to kind of lose it a little bit because of the substance D causing him so much brain damage. And so these last few chapters of the book go into a lot more detail about that. So Bob Arctor, as we remember, is being observed 24/7 because the police department has received a tip from an anonymous source who Bob Arctor believes to be James Barris, a tip that Bob Arctor is like a substantial dealer and has connections to like large dealers and is going to help bust somebody bigger, and that's what Barris is kind of saying. Though we know that that's exactly what Barris just kind of seems to know. He seems to be one step ahead, in my opinion, of Arctor at all times. So, to that end, Barris has been kind of planting or doing things randomly in order to kind of get at Bob Arctor. At least that's what Arctor thinks. So for a long period of time, Arctor is suspicious that Barris has written a check and gone to a locksmith in order to like get a copy of the keys or something like that, and a copy. I don't know if it was a copy of the house key or a copy of the car key, but he went there in order to get a copy of the keys, and we find out eventually that it actually was not James Barris who wrote the check from the bad account. It was, in fact, Bob Arctor. But Bob Arctor has to, like, go to the locksmith and pay up his bad check and a bunch of other things, and then call them again and ask, hey, where did you guys meet me to make these keys? And they told him, oh, at this place in where was it? San Marin or San something like that, Santa Rosa or something like that. One of the metropolitan areas immediately surrounding Los Angeles. And so he was like, Bob Arctor realizes that there's no way that Barris wrote that check because he definitely wrote that check. And so that's like this weird realization that he kind of has, about, like what, and this is kind of like what Philip K. Dick has been doing with a lot of the stuff in this novel. Is like, oh, what's real? What's not? What should we be suspicious of? What should we just kind of write off as being, like not a big deal? Things like that. So it definitely has been a wild ride. Bob Arctor is kind of like losing his marbles from brain damage caused by substance D, and he's losing them pretty fast, which is a bummer because, nobody ever wishes brain damage on anyone, but the substance D, that's what it does, is it kind of it degrades your ability to live. Last time we had checked in on Donna and Bob Arctor, they weren't exactly doing super well as far as their relationship, quote unquote, was concerned. Donna very much did not want to sleep with Bob Arctor, but Bob Arctor very much wants to sleep with her, and so that didn't happen. And then Bob Arctor started hallucinating about her being in his bed with him, but he knew that she wasn't, so it was definitely a little bit weird and funky. As far as the story is concerned, we are at a point where brain damage has become prevalent in the narrative that Bob Arctor is telling us, so much so that we're starting to see splits in like language. So I didn't look it up, but there are several passages in German that just kind of start out of nowhere. And I think the point of that is to kind of like jar you into feeling something similar to what Bob Arctor would be feeling because of the brain damage caused by the drugs, which is an interesting storytelling mechanic. Don't know if I think it's like corny or not. A lot of this book kind of like toys with the edge of being like not good anymore. Hate to phrase it like that, but it's the only way I can think to say it. So this book kind of like walks up to the edge of like, I guess, bad experimental writing, and then kind of is like, oh, we're gonna dip our toes in this water. So there's definitely good parts and bad parts to it. But I overall thought it was a really effective way for Philip K. Dick to kind of like tell us, or show us rather, how Bob Arctor is like falling apart. Because he really is falling apart. He's forgetting checks, he's forgetting random facts, and so on that note, Bob Arctor actually does get called into the medical staff, I guess, the medical department again, and has this really long test administered to him along with a blood sample taken from him, all so that they can figure out whether or not he is going to continue to be allowed to do his work. And what they find is that there's a pretty substantial amount of brain damage that has occurred from substance D. and that his brain is essentially like split in half. And so it's operating like completely independently of each other. And the way they describe it is that you have two fuel gauges on a car, and you can look at both of them, but neither of them are right, and the gas tank has actually fallen out of the car like a mile ago. So basically, like, there's nothing going on in his head that's really worthy of note, in their opinion. And so, but of course, like, that doesn't mean that Bob Archer's not going to think or experience anything at all. He still, like, has this innate human desire to live. So there's going to be some sort of thing that's happening in his head at all times. And so one of the ways in which that we start to notice Bob Archer kind of like having this split is in one, obviously the split between using German and English, but also Bob Archer starts like disassociating himself with or from Hank, or rather Hank starts associating himself from Bob Archer. So like he'll be watching the screen and forget that he's Bob Archer. So when he's watching all of the footage of the house that he lives in, he'll be watching it and getting upset with Bob Archer and all these scumbags, as he calls them, and wonder why he's watching, like, why am I not doing more about this? We're going to get this guy. And then all of a sudden out of nowhere, he's Bob Archer again. And so there's like this weird line between him in the scramble suit and doing his job and like him out in the real world. And he's starting to become like a little bit more, I don't know, like childishly obsessed with Donna, I think would be the best way to phrase it. And in addition to that, we finally get to confirm that Barris is the one who is giving in the tips. Barris appears in person in order to, I guess, not indict, but just like levy as much evidence as possible against Bob Archer. And of course, the police officers or the police department is more than willing to acquiesce and receive his information, because they, of course, don't know that Bob Archer is, in fact, like literally in this case, standing right in front of them. So, yeah. So there's been this like really good job by Philip K. Dick of trying to like create this world where we're not sure exactly what's true and what's false, in the same way that the main character is not sure of what is true and what is false. There's this like sense of paranoia that is finally resolved by the fact that we get to learn, oh yes, it is James Barris who called in the tip. It is James, whatever. It is Jim Barris who is trying to bust Archer. And so while Barris is in the office, he kind of, he says that Bob Archer has gone crazy and that all these other things. And then Frank, who's Hank's boss, who's Bob Archer's boss, when Jim Barris leaves, Frank and Hank, which are terrible names, have a little bit of a discussion about, like, you need to go to the this is before the medical evaluation. So he tells him, he's the one who tells him you need to go see the medical staff, and they kind of have a little bit of a discussion about, James Barris and what it is that he's up to and why he's trying to do what he wants to do. And like, there's, I think, some commentary by Philip K. Dick in this particular section on like the justice system itself, which I think has been something that Philip K. Dick has talked about frequently throughout this particular novel, where it's like the consequences of a crime seem kind of silly in some capacity, and like the evidence necessary to get somebody who's done something seriously wrong is much more substantial than the evidence necessary to get a conviction on somebody who's done something like much more benign, quote unquote. So I think that there's definitely some commentary by Philip K. Dick in that regard. And as far as like plot, a basic plot, that's pretty much it. And once you get to the end of the book, it moves pretty rapidly, and that there's like twists and turns and things that I kind of just want to like summarize what happens before all of the twists and turns, because it's like a roller coaster. Once you're on it, you're kind of signed up for it, and it doesn't really stop. So we're going to talk about the twists at the end. It's the same as the movie. And so we will do that right after this next commercial, or this first commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Finishing up the, I don't know if I want to call it secondary plot. We were finishing up the character plot with Bob Arctor and, you know, his journey to, I guess, his journey deep into mental instability caused by drug overuse or drug misuse, I guess, or proper drug use, if you could call it that. There is kind of like an interesting dichotomy that happens within this book that I think is worthy of note, where there is kind of this narrative that happens within all of the individual characters and also a narrative that happens external to those characters, where that's kind of like the overall overarching point of, not overarching point. It's just, so the movie and the book, they both end with the same kind of like twist ending, where we find out that Donna is actually Hank, who is Frank's, aka Bob Arctor's boss. So Donna is also an undercover police officer, and the movie has the same twist, of course. And so what we find out is that Bob Arctor's paranoia is not misplaced in any regard other than who he's directing it towards, because Barris is in fact after him, but not for the reason that and for kind of the reason that Bob Arctor suspects him of being after him, though why Barris would be after Arctor is kind of a mystery to us, because we don't know if Barris knows that Arctor is an undercover cop. We don't know if Barris just is worried that Arctor is a potential competitor in the dealing industry, because it's very clear that Barris is a dealer of multiple different drugs. And what we find out is that Barris is also involved in some sort of arms dealing as well. And so Bob Arctor is actually being used by the Los Angeles Police Department in order to get to James Barris, rather than Bob Arctor being used for the purposes that he felt he would be used for, which was just to kind of not arbitrarily, but intentionally catch whatever happenstantial drug pusher or dealer he could get as he tried to work his way up the ladder of the supply chain. So the hope for Bob Arctor was to catch Barris dealing or catch Donna dealing, and then not bust them necessarily, because he needs them to kind of remain anonymous in some capacities to the police department. But as he orders more and more substance D from them, he is hoping that eventually he's going to be able to work his way up the ladder of dealers from Donna to her supplier, to that supplier's supplier, to that supplier's supplier, to eventually get to the source of substance D, which to this point has been a mystery to the Los Angeles Police Department because the people who supply it are just so good at remaining, anonymous or manipulating the system, and that is in part because of what the drug itself does. Because it causes so much brain damage, there is there's a difficulty in getting up the chain while still remaining sober enough to report on the information and be considered a valid source of that information. So Bob Arctor gets really addicted to substance D and starts to take I don't know if you could call it too much, because I don't think you can overdose on substance D, because there's a character who decides to commit suicide by overdose, but doesn't do it with substance D. He does it with, I want to say heroin and some other pill and then alcohol, and he was hoping to kill himself. He does not succeed. He just ends up putting himself in a permanently comatose state where he believes himself to be hearing some sort of otherworldly thing reading off his sins to him ad infinitum, or never ending, ceaselessly. So basically he's just kind of stuck in this weird, dimension. His body is stuck being alive and his consciousness is alive, but he's stuck in this place where there's this thing that is just reading off all of his sins to him throughout the entirety of his life. And so I don't think substance D can kill you with an overdose, but it will, put you in a permanently comatose or a permanently damaged state that's pretty substantial. And so we find out that Bob Arctor is being used by the Los Angeles Police Department to get an undercover agent into one of the places that they're suspicious is a primary supplier of substance D. And oddly enough, that suspicion is what's confirmed at the end of the book. But also, the suspicion is that New Haven, which is one of the largest rehabilitation facilities in the United States, it's a federal rehabilitation facility, though I don't know how much government involvement it actually has. I don't know if it's just subsidized by the government or anything like that. Oh wait, no, it's private. Yeah, it's different. I apologize. No, it's a private rehabilitation clinic. It's one of the main ones. And so I guess the Los Angeles Police Department is suspicious that New Haven is one of the primary suppliers of substance D, but they don't know how, so they have to get someone on the inside. But the problem is that New Haven is incredibly, fastidious or dedicated to ensuring that nobody is able to get into their facilities who either isn't in on the game or who doesn't already have substantial brain damage caused by substance D. And so what the police department does is basically allow Arctor to go down this path of addiction by placing him, or by allowing him to continue doing it as what it is that he's doing, and then encouraging him down the path of addiction by providing more substance D for him, by allowing James Barris to, I would guess they kind of blew Bob Arctor's cover with James Barris, so James Barris is actively trying to sabotage him. So I think that there's a pretty hard turning point in the book where James Barris does in fact poison Bob Arctor, and so there's that issue, of course. But so the police department allows this to happen to Bob Arctor. And so when Bob Arctor gets the results of his medical test back, they basically strip him of his badge, if you will, and his responsibilities. And they tell him, you need to, either you need to go get help. And then maybe if you come back and you're good to go, we'll put you back out there. But, the way you find out that Donna is an undercover agent is that when Bob Arctor is relieved, he starts to, have a breakdown, and he hasn't had any substance D in a little while, so he's withdrawing a little bit. And so the Hank calls somebody, or at least pretends to call somebody, and then goes and changes and is Donna, and goes and picks up Bob Archer and takes him to a care facility. Well, on the way to the facility, Bob Archer asks to do some drugs with Donna because he doesn't really know exactly where he's going, and I don't know exactly why he ends up deciding to do what it is that he does. But he goes to on their way to New Haven, they stop and they smoke some weed, I think, on the side of the road, and a cop catches them, and Donna reveals that she's an undercover agent to the cop so that she can continue to take Bob Archer to this New Haven facility. And that's how we find out that Donna has been kind of orchestrating this the whole time in some capacity. And so they get to the facility, and Bob Archer is just a mess. The withdrawals for substance D are rather similar to the withdrawals from heroin, where you soil yourself, you're freaking out, you're shaking, cold sweats, all sorts of things. And then you add on top of that, like, the brain damage associated with substance D being pretty substantial. Bob Archer is pretty much reduced to, like, a very childlike state. And there's a lot of talk of the fact that the individuals who experience the brain damage from substance D have, like, experienced some sort of spiritual awakening or spiritual vision that other people won't get to experience because they haven't tried substance D. And that's definitely intentional. A lot of people, especially in the 60s when this book would have been being written, were, making claims that drugs were something that gave them a specific access to a certain kind of truth when they were, taking them. And so I am fairly confident that Philip K. Dick, who at the end of the book mentions that he has also been a person who suffered from addiction to these hard narcotics, that he would be trying to say, like, look, there is some sort of weird spiritual thing that happens when you alter your consciousness as drastically as you possibly can via drugs. There is this weird kind of experience that you get that comes at a price, and is that price really worth it? The guy who tries to kill himself has this experience where he believes that he's transcended in some capacity, only for that experience to yield him being read his sins for the rest of his existence. And Bob Archer has, like, a similar experience of, it's like, oh, did I see God? Did I have some sort of, like, profoundly enlightening experience that gave my life more meaning? And is the cost of that, like, my sanity and my mental health for the rest of my life? There is kind of this general theme towards the end of the book of, like, well, is the high worth it? Is the addiction that these drugs cause, is the damage that they cause, is it worth it in the end? Or has it all just kind of been, like, happenstantial consequences to the decisions that we make? And how should I feel about that kind of a thing? And so we are kind of called into question that as well. And I would say that, like, from the way that Philip K. Dick has portrayed this whole thing, I think that there's a lot of ignorance or that Philip K. Dick is trying to talk about, where he's saying, like, look, these people are, and myself included, have been addicted to these substances that are, like, benign ultimately in the grand scheme of existence, but in the scheme of, like, humanness, we ought to kind of view the people who use them as being lacking in something that other people have, or in having an abundance of something that other people don't have as much of. And, whether that's, like, a desire for more meaning from life like Bob Archer, or if that's an escape from, like, some sort of traumatizing past like Donna is kind of portrayed as having towards the beginning of the novel, or if it's just, like, an addiction that's a part of the physical aspect of your existence that was kind of foisted upon you by someone who was malicious in their intent, like the multiple stories of pushers who will give individuals large doses of substance D without the person who's taking the substance D knowing that they're getting this large dose, or knowing that they're getting dosed with substance D at all, just to get them hooked so that that person will then push more drugs for them or buy more drugs from them. And so there's definitely this commentary on the fact that, like, I wouldn't say that Philip K. Dick is trying to advocate for like the legalization of drugs in any capacity in this book, but there's definitely it seems to me like a push by him to kind of like educate people on, the detrimental effects of these drugs on your life when you choose to take them, because ultimately Philip K. Dick does say that like it is a choice for these individuals to partake in these drugs. So we're going to keep talking about some of those themes and some of those reoccurring ideas within this novel right after this next commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
After the last break. So before the break, we were kind of talking about maybe some of Philip K. Dick's goals with his portrayal of addiction, as well as some of the plot and how that plays into like the themes and goals that Philip K. Dick has when he went to write this particular novel. So I was kind of talking about how Philip K. Dick isn't necessarily advocating for like a legalization of drugs, but I think he's advocating for more education on them. There's a dedication at the end of the book that is actually really powerful, where Philip K. Dick says specifically that taking drugs is absolutely a choice. And that individuals who are addicted are still making a choice to take those drugs in some capacity. But what he says is that their choice isn't one that includes a full understanding of what it is that they're getting themselves into. Their choice is one of ignorance, of a childlike ignorance. He specifically compares drug use to children playing in the street. Children are compelled to play. It's part of their genetic makeup. It's part of it's part of the way that creatures with higher cognitive function learn about the world around them and learn to interact with other members of their species and other things within their environment. It's how, tools are created by play in some capacity. Now, oftentimes necessity is what creates a tool, like chimpanzees and them using sticks to get termites out of a mound. Like that is a tool of necessity in some capacity because, you need to eat, obviously, to survive. But play is also a necessity in that it helps to establish like certain things that are built into the human or animal or mammal really experience. And so for Philip K. Dick to use this or use that specific wording to try and help us to understand drug use in general, I think what he's saying is that like we are all compelled to do certain things that are a natural part of the human experience. And the unfortunate reality is that sometimes in that space of compellment, I guess, if that's a word, there are individuals who choose to partake in drugs. And they're choosing to partake in drugs in a way where they don't know the true dangers of what it is that they're doing. When little kids play in the street, they don't necessarily think to themselves, oh, I could get hit by a car. That's not something that's within their wheelhouse, even if you almost have to get hit by the car to know that you could get hit by the car. Because even when your parents tell you, like, be careful, there are people in the street who might not be paying attention while they're driving or what have you, and you need to respect that. That's a taught thing. And because there hasn't, especially when Philip K. Dick was writing this, there wasn't a ton of education on these drugs. People didn't know that cocaine mimicked dopamine and would slot itself into your dopamine receptors, and that's how it gets you hooked. They didn't know how, what LSD did to your mind in the same way that they do now. And even now we don't have a full understanding of what it is that these drugs are capable of doing, either helping either in a positive or negative way. We just don't know. There's all sorts of studies that indicate that small doses of hallucinogens can help with depression, but how small, how many, how often, when should you take them? How should we handle that? We don't know those things. And so, and oftentimes people who take those drugs are from just less affluent areas. Not to say that I am an authority in any regard as to drug use in the United States or anywhere in the world. Just oftentimes in the media, the people who are most, in movies and things, people who are most involved in drugs usually start out from a place of poverty. If you look at a lot of the movies where drugs are a big deal, most of those individuals don't exactly have the greatest life growing up or things like that. If you look at Wolf of Wall Street, it's not like that guy came from money. He lived in squalor for a long time. And, just in general. So I'm not saying that this is a reflection of real life. I'm just talking about what's been portrayed in the media. So the perception is generally that people of lower income or of traumatic childhood experiences are the ones who do these drugs primarily. And they're doing them because they're compelled in some capacity to do something about the pain or insignificance, lack of meaning that they're feeling, and they find that solution in drugs, but they don't know what it is that they're doing to themselves because they don't fully grasp the ramifications of their actions. And yeah, there are, of course, exceptions to this rule. Cigarette smoking is a great example. Almost every cigarette smoker I know, they know how unhealthy it is for them. They also happen to think that they will be one of the 500 people who won't have anything terrible happen to them because they choose to participate in this particular drug. And that's their choice, but it's a choice. And I think that's what Philip K. Dick is saying, is that ultimately we make a lot of these choices in our lives, and some people choose drugs and they don't realize the full, the entirety of the ramifications that come along with their drug addiction or with their drug of choice. And so when they're going through that, they're kind of just not, I guess, they're not as aware of everything as they ought to be. And so in some capacities, those individuals they're just as deserving of empathy and love and help as anybody else is. And I think that's Philip K. Dick's biggest point with this novel, is that the people who are addicted to drugs are often portrayed as being these burnt out losers who don't have anything interesting to say. And even Bob Arctor plays into this stereotype where he's watching the videos of himself and his friends, quote unquote, just hanging out and talking, and he's tired of hearing what it is that they have to say. And I think that experience serves multiple purposes. One, it serves to say that, like, Bob Archer is just ultimately unsatisfied with life, period, because he got on drugs because he felt like there was, like, no meaning in his regular life. Like, he even says that, you know, this is how people get addicted to substance D when he's at the very beginning of the book. These people who are just, like, completely lacking in substance. And then substance D, lacking in substance. And then towards the end of the book, as he's watching what it is that he and these other people are doing, he's realizing, like, this is just as devoid of substance. Like, I just thought that it would be more because I was taking drugs. Like, the same way that, you know, did I see God? Did I not? Like, what's happening? Like, it's the same exact thing of, like, feeling like there's supposed to be more to this experience, but there just isn't. And ultimately it ends up being lacking in a very profound and, like, devoid way. So it just it's it's sad, really, is the best way to phrase it, in my opinion. It is just kind of the unfortunate result of ignorance and really of not valuing the self and not knowing where to look to get help for that lack of value in the self. And so I think that kind of lost my train of thought there, but one of the primary reasons that this is so prevalent and that this is something that Philip K. Dick mentions specifically in the it's not really an epilogue, it's kind of just like a dedication of sorts, it's like a long form dedication, is that I think Philip K. Dick really wants to advocate for these individuals who are experiencing these things in a way that's, like, meaningful and impactful. And he just is not, he doesn't feel that society is able to do that. He even specifically says that it's a shortcoming of society and not a shortcoming of the person, that they don't have knowledge of the drugs or that they seek out the drugs in the first place, because society doesn't provide an alternative to individuals who are going through specific things that would make them have a proclivity for drug use. And so I think that that's really powerful. I think that, in my opinion, Philip K. Dick's statements that he makes within this novel are still poignant commentary on the way that we handle drug use today. We look at it as some sort of, like, criminal offense that is worthy of substantial punishment, but really these people oftentimes have punished themselves enough in some capacity to where it's like, okay, we get it. You had these difficult things go on in your life and you didn't have any help that could have helped you or that could have given you the tools to cope with them. So instead of turning to, like, the self, you turned to, or to help from outside, you turned to drugs. And you didn't know that they were going to destroy you even more. And so you have not only been, like, destroyed by the things around you without us knowing, but you've been destroyed by drugs without you knowing. And that ultimately is kind of like, well, shouldn't that be punishment enough in itself? Like, isn't a child who deals with the guilt of lying often, like, let off the hook in some capacity because they tell the truth? Because they've already made themselves suffer enough, and that's punishment enough. And I'm not saying, of course, that there shouldn't be any kind of, like, punishment around drug use. I'm just talking about what Philip K. Dick has to say about all of this. And so I think that this book is actually really important in that regard, because it does something that a lot of books and movies about drugs aren't able to do as effectively as this does, especially with the letter that Philip K. Dick writes at the end of it, where it just humanizes individuals who use drugs in a way that can give us a structure by which to constructively empathize with them and kind of, in some ways, makes you want to advocate for those individuals in a way that doesn't, like, condone their decision necessarily, but in a way that allows them to have recourse if it goes awry, when it goes badly. Because of the fact of the matter is that if you use drugs, the chances of you coming out of that on the other side being clean or being undamaged are incredibly low. And I think that is something that Philip K. Dick just finds to be like sad and difficult, because the fact of the matter is that individuals should be able to get help. And that is something that people have a lot of opinions on, as to who should provide that help and such. But I don't think Philip K. Dick is specifically trying to say anything about that, though he does specifically mention that federal rehabilitation clinics are not as good as the private ones. But we'll get into why that is right after this last commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
So right before the break, I was kind of talking about Philip K. Dick's just general commentary, opinion, the themes in this novel surrounding the ideas of drug use and addiction, and why it is that he is saying these things. I mentioned the letter that he wrote after. So I kind of want to cover a little bit more of the twist with this last portion of the podcast, because I think that plays a pretty pivotal role in the overall, in the point that Philip K. Dick is trying to make in some capacity. So we find out that the Los Angeles Police Department is suspicious of New Haven, which is is a company that runs the rehabilitation clinics that individuals who are addicted to drugs go to in order to get clean. And there's a suspicion that New Haven is also supplying substance D. And so their goal was to have Arthur infiltrate that organization, so they caused him to have just enough mental damage from substance D to where he could maybe recover and come back with the evidence that they need, and he could remember that in some capacity. So when he gets admitted, he's of course obsessed with seeing Donna again. So he is very interested in women, but not in a perverted way, in a "is Donna here" type of way. He ends up being very endearing to children, and has enough mental capacity to realize that the children in these facilities are they're the children of people who had addictions or took drugs while they were pregnant and things like that. So there's all sorts of issues that come along with that. As well as I think there's some just general special needs children there. And so he kind of bonds with them in a very almost playmate, brotherly, big brother way, rather than a parental way. And that's interesting because there's a lot of I guess strata would be maybe the right word. There's kind of a hierarchy of sorts. There's certain roles that certain individuals are supposed to fill within even the rehabilitation facility, where one of the people who's working there tells Arctur that he can't, he's not supposed to be involved with the children's, I don't know if you want to call it outreach or children's help that they provide, because he's not old. And old people would be upset if there was a younger guy in there, because that's all that old people can do, really, is kind of read stories to kids. And so there's this weird sort of unspoken, you do this and not this, and you do that and not that type of thing that's going on in this whole situation, that is kind of funny, because it's just seems arbitrary in some capacity, that even when you are damaged and you're suffering from the damage that you caused yourself, like even then people will be imposing these weird rules on you and these weird roles on you, and you're just like less aware of the ability to fight against those. So you just kind of comply. And that's ultimately what a lot of what Substance D does, is it puts you into a place of compliance. So New Haven, or from the beginning of the book, we're told that Substance D is a synthetic drug, and which is one of the very few differences between the film and the book. In the film, they say that it's a drug, it's an agricultural drug the entire time. They say that it's a derivative of opiates. And in the book, they say that it is related to opiates, but in a synthetic sense. Well, what we find out towards the end of the book is that Substance D is in fact an agricultural product. It is the product of these tiny little blue flowers. And so Arctur kind of talks about how like different drugs are grown and how police departments catch the individuals who are growing those drugs by flying overhead. And what we find out is that these flowers are growing amongst the corn that Arctur is tasked with taking care of, because Arctur is eventually transferred out of the rehab facility onto a farm. And while he's on the farm, his job is basically just going to be to spray plants with pesticides. But what Bob Arctur doesn't fail to know, or fails to realize, is that while he's spraying the plants, he's going to be inhaling the fumes of these insecticides, and the insecticides will further deteriorate his brain. There's like specific mention of the fact that insecticides will aggravate the brain damage that he's already experienced. But he just kind of like, oh yeah, that's cool, I'll spray the plants. So, and then there's this idea of like being alive and dead that is specifically mentioned by Philip K. Dick, where he kind of says that, like, the living should never serve the dead, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the dead shouldn't serve the living. In fact, death should serve only to the living. And so Philip K. Dick is kind of trying to say that, like, once you're down this path this far, that you are dead. And so in some capacities, I feel confident that Philip K. Dick is saying, the individuals who produce these drugs, the individuals who push these drugs, they are murderers in some capacity, because they're basically destroying people's ability to be human. They're just killing people or they're letting people kill themselves, but they're providing them the tools to do so. So they're ultimately responsible in some capacity. And then on top of that, the fact that the rehabilitation clinics are the primary source of the drugs, to me, is Philip K. Dick saying, like, this system is incredibly broken because it perpetuates addiction. Now, I don't know if he had enough clairvoyance at the time in the 60s to be like, oh, mass incarceration is part of the problem, poverty is part of the problem, lack of mental health help is a major part of the problem, because all of those things, in my opinion, are true. But I don't think that that's what Philip K. Dick is necessarily trying to say when he's writing this novel. I think that he's just trying to say that, like, hey, look, something in this system is broken. Something in this system perpetuates these habits. Something in this system causes people to feel the need to pursue this alternative form of satisfaction through drug use. And that is a problem that we as a society need to address, because there are real people who would otherwise have substantial things to offer to those around them, substantial things to offer to society and their communities, if they were given the help that they needed in order to kind of like achieve those things, if you will. And so the fact that the system itself, the system of recovery, is also the system of addiction is, like, very powerful, in my opinion. And now Bob Arctur I was hoping that the book would go further than the movie, where we would actually get to see if Bob Arctur is able to provide evidence to the police department that New Haven is growing these flowers, or at least this particular New Haven is growing these flowers. We don't know if it's all of them, but this particular facility is participating in the drug trade. in the movie, he takes a flower and puts it in his pocket and wants to give it to Donna when he sees her for Thanksgiving. And the same is true in the book. That's kind of like the end of the book is we get this like moral conundrum of Donna who says like, okay, he didn't sign up for this, and like it just seems really wrong that we used him without him being aware. And then the other police officer says, well, of course he couldn't have been aware because then he, wouldn't have acted in a way that would solicit like a sincere rock bottom that would get him allowed into a New Haven facility. And then when he was in the facility, he would have acted suspiciously because he would have had a mission rather than just kind of like aimlessly wandering because of the brain damage. And then on top of that, if you get brain damage and you're aware of something, like there's paranoia and things that you're going to reveal, and that would be a whole different novel, which would also be an interesting novel in my opinion. But regardless, so he says basically like, look, we're doing the right thing. Ultimately, the good that could come from this far outweighs the bad. And there is a little bit of a utilitarian vein throughout this novel of like, is X worth Y? What are the consequences of these things really worthy of the high that I get from them? Am I getting any more meaning out of life doing this thing than I would otherwise? There's this idea surrounding Bob Archer's house throughout the novel that we hear repeatedly, where he says like, oh, this house deserves so much better, or it could be so much better, and they should like, the police department should take the house, or like I should sell the house so that it can become what it's supposed to be. And that, like, I think is both a personal statement of Bob Archer saying, like, oh, I'm kind of, like, wasting my potential a lot. And that's also, I think, in my opinion, Philip K. Dick saying, like, all these people are wasting their potential by doing these drugs, but they don't have any help to stop doing them. And when they do try to get help to stop doing them, it ultimately just kind of pushes them further along the path of addiction. And they end up deeper into the problem than they were originally. And so there's just a bunch of different things kind of like all orbiting around the main like point of this book, which I think, if I had to sum it up, the primary objective of Philip K. Dick is to humanize a group of individuals who are often demonized, especially in like the early 70s, and Philip K. Dick references specifically that they've just come out of the 60s, the hippie era, where like people were doing drugs because they thought that it would provide them some sort of spiritual enlightenment. They were doing drugs because they didn't think it would be a big deal. They were doing drugs because of X, Y, and Z things. And ultimately, like, those people are demonized as being lazy hippies or like, crazy addicts who are dangerous and things like that. But I think what Philip K. Dick is trying to say is like, look, these people are just human beings who have gone down a bad path without knowing that they were doing that. Bob Archer is so disassociated from himself that he doesn't even realize until he's able to watch himself in a camera that the void that he thinks himself to be filling is not being filled in any capacity. He is ultimately just as unsatisfied with life as he ever was before he was involved in drugs. And we also find out that Bob Archer doesn't have kids. That the entire family thing is pretty much just a fantasy that he has constructed because of like the brain damage and his desires in his head. Which, well, it's not really confirmed, but it's heavily implied that the entire time that he's been saying, oh, I have 2 daughters, that he's been lying without knowing it. And so even there, I think, is just this commentary that people kind of always want what it is that they don't have and think that it will be more satisfying than what it is that they do have. And so for us to think that Archer had kids at some point and watch him go down this terrible path to brain damage and a permanently altered state of being that isn't necessarily beneficial, like for us to watch that and think the whole time like, oh, this guy used to have a family, like he thought he was getting into something that would be more fulfilling, and ultimately it's just as unfulfilling as anything else in his life has ever been. And so that really kind of drives home this point that like we as individuals are compelled to pursue things that will make us think the grass is greener, or compelled to try and see if the grass is in fact greener. But the reality is that things are just different shades of the same thing. someone who's going to be unsatisfied with family life is going to be unsatisfied with their life outside of that family 9 times out of 10. Unless there are extenuating circumstances like an incredibly toxic partner or something like that. You know, like the reality is that there is this compulsion that we have as individuals to think that something could be better if we changed our circumstances and not ourselves. And I think that that is like a big part of what Philip K. Dick is trying to say with this novel, is that we need to give help to these individuals to figure out that they can change themselves without having to alter their consciousness, without having to take drugs, without them feeling the need to be alienated. And that we should be doing that because really it's like teaching children. And we need to teach children how to, you know, behave and like teach them the ramifications of their actions in some capacity. So I think that that's really powerful and really important for us to remember. So yeah, that's A Scanner Darkly. I don't know what we'll be talking about next Wednesday. I know Sunday we'll be talking about Endymion more, so stay tuned for that if you're following that particular aspect of this podcast. Thanks for sticking around for that. It's been a long series. I think we started back in like January on Hyperion, and we've just been talking every Sunday about that whole series. So I'm excited to continue doing that, and then next Wednesday we'll talk about something else, maybe something else from Philip K. Dick, not totally sure yet. But overall, that's all I've got for you guys this week. Really appreciate y'all tuning in. Hope that you guys will, tune in again. If you like the podcast, give us a follow. Follow us on Twitter, all social media as well, Facebook, all that jazz. Feel free to leave us reviews, tweet at us, things like that. We appreciate all of the engagement that we can get. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great rest of your week, guys. Stay safe out there.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.